welcome to Writer, a program for and about writers. I'm your host, Rona Brinlee, and I'm very honored today to be talking with John Dufresne, the author of numerous books. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Good to be here, Rona.
I want to start by telling you how much I've enjoyed all your books. They're all extremely funny, but I also know that there's a very contemplative underpinning of serious stuff in there.
Yeah.
And I want to know how you combine the two. You stay funny and that you have all that serious good stuff.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I do it exactly, and it's not always conscious. I think I like humor myself. I like to laugh, and I think sometimes when dealing with, for example, in Deep in the Shade of Paradise, one of the issues we're dealing with is somebody with Alzheimer's, which is a kind of frightening and sad thing, losing yourself and losing your identity, losing your past, and that when you're dealing with issues like that, it helps the reader, I think, sometimes to lighten up a little bit so that things aren't always so grim, that there are moments of lightness to help you sort of breathe and continue on. And so I think in that sense, maybe it's to that extent it's calculated, but otherwise I like characters who are eccentric, and I start writing about them, and they do funny things, and I write it down. So.
Well, I know you're not from the South. You talk about eccentric characters, but do you consider yourself a Southern writer?
Well, I don't. I just consider myself a writer, and I write about the South, and I also have written about the North as well, where I come from New England. So I don't, there's people are interested in that question and always find it amusing or interesting that a Yankee would come down and write about the South. But I think the notion of regional writing is kind of erroneous and somewhat pejorative. If you're a Southern writer, then you can only write about the South, for example. I think maybe this is a New York attitude. I don't know what I'm talking about. You don't hear anyone say he's a New York writer, kind of thing. And it's like wanting to keep you in the region where you grew up, or something like that, which, of course, all writing is regional. It all has to take place somewhere, in some place. Andre Dubus is an example of somebody from Louisiana who went to Massachusetts and wrote about it. I often wonder if he was asked, that question about how come you're coming up here writing about us Yankees? And so, I think your job as a writer is to write about and imagine a place that the reader would love to live in. And so, for me, sometimes that's in Louisiana, and sometimes it's in Florida, and sometimes it's in New England. So I just want to write, and I write differently about different regions. There's a different voice when you write about the North, Massachusetts, as opposed to Louisiana, and it may be a different cadence. But there are eccentrics everywhere, as we were talking about earlier, we're more proud of them in the South than. In New England, we tried to hide them.
Here we trot them out for company. So do you think that there is a difference? I saw in an interview that you've had before talking about in New England, people want to know why. In the South, they want a different answer to the question.
Yeah, it's in the South, they don't want the answer. They want to tell you how something happened. There's in New England, there is a sort of, let me say, in my own experience growing up in Massachusetts, it was everybody, all of my friends' parents or grandparents were from somewhere else. They were from Italy, they were from Canada, they were from Ireland. Ireland's not a good example because of what I'm going to say, which is they all came over speaking different languages, learned English, and English was the language of commerce and information, and if they were going to read even a newspaper, they read it, my family, in French. And my mother even grew up speaking French. And so there was a different relationship with the language. In the South, at least in the places in the South where I've lived, Georgia, Arkansas, and Louisiana, that I know about, English was the only language for hundreds of years. That was it. And so it was the language of telling stories and the language of romance and all of those kinds of things. And so people had a different relationship to it and weren't just trying to buy something or just try to get information. They would just, I'm going to tell you a story, and it's going to take me a long time.
Yeah.
And so on. And I'm going to embellish it, and I'm going to digress, and I'm going to tell you about my uncle, and so on. So it is different, and I try to hear those differences when I'm writing about whatever region it is.
But do you find that your readers are not regional then?
Well, no, I think the readers are, that's an interesting question, because I was thinking of it recently. I just finished a book tour, and on my book tours, I always go to the South, I always go to New England, and then sometimes I go to the West Coast, sometimes I go to the Midwest, but they just left out everything from Monroe, Louisiana to San Francisco was like gone. And I was wondering, well, nobody reads me out there in the great, the great basin or whatever it is. I don't know. I think I might be actually more sort of well known in the South and I think because people have said I'm a Southern writer.
Right.
That people are familiar with my work, and it might be just that I go around reading in the South more often. But I think I don't think there's a regional sort of reader.
Okay.
I grew up reading Southern literature. I mean, that was my favorite literature.
Okay,
and I'm from New England.
Right.
And I couldn't wait to get rid of Hawthorne and Melville and those guys and get to Faulkner and Flannery and all those folks. So, and that was the literature that I loved. So I felt like I lived here before, imaginatively, before I ever moved down here.
Well, Southern literature is not a bad thing to be called a Southern writer
No,
these days.
not at
It's
all,
a good
no.
genre.
No, but it's just curious that people want to say Southern.
Right.
And it's not. I'm just not talking about myself, but just the idea of that means. Oh, you write good about those odd, strange, Gothic people who live down there. With the refrigerators on the front porch and the car up on blocks and the uncle with 100 cats writing letters to the Clarion Ledger and all that kind of stuff. And those aren't real people. I mean, there was a big thing. I know this because I was teaching at the time, that Tom Wolfe, Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast, which was, you have to write social realism and you have to write about New York City. Nobody cares about people in the trailer parks and whatnot. I'm the opposite. I believe the opposite of all of that.
But do they have some universal reality? I mean, the Fontanas are pretty strange. You introduce them in Louisiana Power and Light and then pick them back up in Deep in the Shade of Paradise. I mean, they're pretty exotic characters in there. Do they have some reality for you? They're real people?
Oh, yeah, they're absolutely real. They've been a family that's had, sort of a catastrophic history, and bad things happen to them, and sometimes they make them happen, and sometimes they fall into it. But their problems are just as real as anybody else's, and they have to deal with grief and loneliness and pain and abandonment and love, and they're very real. In Deep in the Shade of Paradise, there are only 2 left, and they're as normal as you and I. I'm not sure what that says about them.
Doesn't say much for you and I, but that's okay. I'll take that as a compliment. Just say thanks, John. Yeah. You also, in your books, have the religion intrudes pretty often in your books, and people have talked about the South again as a Christ-haunted landscape. What do you think the role of religion is, and why you make it so important in there?
I don't know, and that permeates everything, whether I'm writing about the South or about the North. Anywhere that people have concerns beyond the material life, and you can think of it in spiritual terms or intellectual terms, that there's more going on than just buying things and distracting yourself and amusing yourself, that there's something else that we hear. And so there's this impulse to try to answer the question why. Why are we here, and what are we doing, and all of that. And so that's I'm interested in exploring that. I think that's what's important. And very often the characters will not resort, but will try to answer that question through faith, or some kind of faith. And there are others who have rejected faith. And need to find some other way. And sometimes, if you reject faith, sometimes you find the answer in art. Delano Sixsmith in this book is an outsider artist, Earlene who writes songs and so forth, trying to find it some other way, but always questioning. So, yeah, and it also comes from, maybe I was raised Catholic, and was, kind of, I would say I was a kind of devout little kid. Went to Catholic schools, was an altar boy, and thought about when I grew up I'd be a priest and all that sort of thing. That it was something going beyond the mundane, I think.
The other thing that is interjected in your book, Louisiana, Power and Light, you have Laugh, who is an author who's writing about two characters he spends the day with, and you intrude yourself into Deep in the Shade of Paradise as the author.
Right.
Why is the concept of writing such an important part of the book?
Well, I'm not. Yeah, it's again, it's like art. It's like asking the question why. Now, part of that is I don't understand it, and you write about what you don't understand, which is why I write about love, and why I write about death, and why I write about why we hurt each other and things like that. And one of the things I don't understand is art, how we make art, and so I'm always thinking about it, and I teach it too, because so it makes me think about it more often, I guess. And I think it's a way, how do we make the world, how do we make things up, how do we make the imaginary real? So it's all of that. And one of the things I was trying to deal with in Deep in the Shade of Paradise was this idea that a story or novel is a creation of both the writer and the reader. And it's why literature moves us like no other art form can, because we're a participant when we're reading in it. We are creating the story along with the writer. I give you a couple of cues or clues or a couple of details, and I say so-and-so walked across the kitchen. You have to make up that person. You have to create the kitchen. I didn't do it. I mentioned it. But in order for you to see the person walking across the kitchen, you had to create the kitchen. So that was the idea in here. So there's even a chapter in here where the reader gets to write.
Right.
Gets to write the chapter about your first love. And it's also that the idea there being that we bring our own experiences and history to the reading of the novel, so that no one ever reads the same book. Everybody's creating characters who look slightly different. Erlene looks different to you than she does to me, and you have a certain history about love that you bring, and so it colors everything that you read about love, this is why I think why we love literature, that it's a creative act. It's not a passive act like watching a movie can be often. And I love movies, nothing against movies, right, but that's a different way, a different way of telling the story or absorbing the story.
So you say the author can only write the story once, but the reader could read it over and over and see something different.
Exactly. And each time you read, we all, there's too much to read, and we'll never read everything we want to read. But when I go back, and I'm sure you do, you go back to books that you've read that have been important in your life, and you read them at different times. I used to read like The Catcher in the Rye, which is a book which really got me into reading, which got me interested in literature. To Kill a Mockingbird and Catcher in the Rye, and I read them around the same time. So every 10 years or so, I go back and read Catcher in the Rye, and my attitude changes. At first, I loved Holden. Then I thought he was a phony. Then I liked him again, and then and it just so it's great to go revisit these people, and the book is completely changed because you have.
So as the writer, do you feel like you spend the day with the characters? Do they take on a life of their own as the book goes along?
Yeah, and it really is. It's all about revision, about the time. And initially, you think you know the character, and you start writing things, and the characters start doing something, and they do something, and you learn something new about them that you didn't know before, and you realize, oh, they wouldn't have done that then before, and you've got to change that. And after a while, there's a point in the writing of every story or novel where a character does something that you didn't expect her to do, says something you didn't expect her to say, and that's when you know you're there. That's when you know you've got a person, and you can't. It's no longer a puppet. You can't make her do what you want her to do anymore. She's got a personality, and that's when you sort of, okay, here's the situation, and you listen. And somebody says something, and you wonder what she's going to do or wonder what she's going to say. She says it, and you write it down. Then maybe you say, well, that's not so good. I'll revise that. Say something else.
It's always a good editor in there.
Yeah.
Well, you actually have footnotes in Deep in the Shade of Paradise, which I thought is fascinating, and you show the structure of a story, and you say yours goes like that.
Yeah, that, go back to influences for a minute, that one of my favorite novels, one that I go back to read, is called Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern, which is one of the first novels written and is more postmodern than any novel that's been written in a long time. And Stern does that sort of thing. That was sort of just stealing it from Stern, the plot diagrams, and showing that, I updated it, using the Freytag pyramid and the Janet Barroway checkmark, and then said, well, but here's where ours is going. We'll never get there the way we're going. This is all digressive. So, so that's fun. That was fun. One of the things writing has to be, because it's a difficult thing to do, is it has to be fun for you, or you're going to stop. And so maybe this is back to your initial question, that partly the comedy's in there to keep me going and keep me interested in the characters and keep me laughing and conniving to make some funny, set up some funny scene or something.
Well, since I think you do write a great story, what to you makes a good story?
Well, it takes you out of your world, for one thing, and puts you into the world of the story. So, you've all had that, we've all had that experience maybe, of reading something and you forget where you are, and your mother calls you for dinner and you realize, 3 hours have gone by, and you don't want to leave the book, or you start reading the book one page a day so it won't end. Right. And you want to stay in that world. So it takes you out, and it also deals with, for me, I think a good story has to deal with the human condition. It has to say, this is what it's like to be a human being, and this is how it feels. That it has to deal with the why. Now, I don't care about plot, other than as a writer and reader, I want to know that the story is going somewhere. I don't want a slice of life. I don't want to be meandering. I want to know there's a struggle and it begins here. The character wants this. This is what's stopping her from getting it, and this is what she does to get it, and she's going to get it or not. So plot does that, but it's why she wants it that's important, and why she's going to struggle, and what it means if she doesn't get it. Those are the questions. So it's always, for me, it's like an iceberg, that the plot is what you see at the top, and was it 9/10 of the, whatever it is, whatever the statistic is, 9/10 of the iceberg is of what's important is beneath the surface of the story. And that's what I try to, that's why I read. I don't like this, it's literature, but I think of it as escapist literature, which means not going to deal with the human condition. We're just going to forget about it. And it becomes the literature of body parts and body counts, People die, death means nothing. So you just mow people down and whatnot. And everyone that dies in a story, every death in a story has to be important. People have, in my thinking,
So how important is what you read to what you write? I mean, you have allusions in here to Confederacy of Dunces a number of times.
Yeah. It's the funniest book I ever read. If you haven't read Confederacy of Dunces, run out and do that. I've been trying to make my son read that for years. And I think because I want him to read it, he won't.
He'll never do it.
But I think it's very important. I think there's only so much time. And this is now, I just realized that I'm sort of paraphrasing Harold Bloom's book, How to Read and Why. I think that's the one, which I read whenever it came out. And he said, look, we're reading against the clock. Mm-hmm. There's no time for mediocrity. Stop it. As I said, I was raised Catholic, which means I'm incredibly anal retentive or whatever. And I used to, if I started a book, I would have to end it. I could not stop in the middle of a book. I don't anymore. I had to get rid of that. If it's not working, throw it away and go get one that's better. Now, of course, it's a matter of taste, and what I think might be terrific literature, someone else might disagree, but I think I want to read about, I want to learn about myself, I want to learn about other people, and I can't do that with reading trash. So throw the trash away. Plus, if you're a writer and you're reading trash, you're going to end up, probably writing trash as well.
So you mentioned Faulkner and Harper Lee. Who else are your favorite authors, or who you like to read?
Well, my favorite author right now is Alice Munro, Canadian short story writer, who I think is just absolutely astounding what she can do in a story. She can write a novel in 30 pages. And William Trevor, an Irish writer, I think those two are sort of, to me, in their own world in terms of literature. And I also, let's see, Alice McDermott, one of the great opening paragraphs, was it That Night, that particular book with this wonderful paragraph. I like Larry Brown and Lewis Norton, some contemporary Southern writers, and I don't know. I just John Berger. I like his essays, but also To the Wedding, a novel he wrote a while ago, 10 years ago or so. Just one of the most marvelous books I've ever read. Just absolutely stunning what he did with that book. It's just the imagination. It's a story that's kind of imagined, within an imagined story within the stories, kind of thing. Just incredible.
We started with a short story writer, and you've written short stories and novels. And what do you see as the difference, and is one harder than the other?
I think writing short stories is more difficult than writing novels, and because in writing novels you can, and this I'm maybe just speaking for myself, because my mind seems to work better in the novel, in the looser form of the novel, and when you can be digressive, and when you can make connections, and you can do improbable things because they're going to pay off later. In a short story, you're always trying to pare things down, take things out. It's more like writing a poem than it is like writing a novel. So it's more relaxing to write a novel. You have 1,000 things to do. Every morning when you get up, you can do one of them. There's no thing, oh, what do I do now? How do I fix this? Well, you don't have to fix it. Go write the next scene. Go do this. So in that sense, it's easier, but of course, it takes longer, and you have to do without short-term gratification, right? There's no payoff. You don't finish anything for years. So I usually try to write some stories while I'm writing novels. I'll just get an idea for a story and do that, or at least make notes toward it. And I usually have 5 or 6 things going at the same time.
At the same time. And you're reading more than one thing at the same time, too?
Oh, I'm reading probably 20 books at the same time. Sometimes it takes so long. I leave one on beside the bed for so long. I have to start over again because I forgot, it's 3 months later and I've read 2 more books or something. I have to go back and start from the beginning. But yeah, it's sort of, you're always reading. All my reading, besides enjoying, goes toward my work. I'm always, what can I learn from this novel? And I read a lot of nonfiction as well, because my characters need to know things and need to do things, and so, and I'm just sort of curious about things and looking for metaphors all over the place. So I read a lot of physics, actually, which I barely understand, but it makes me think metaphorically, to think about, the expanding universe, the Big Bang, all that kind of stuff. And so I need to be reading lots of books at the same time.
So why do you write? Do you write every day?
Yeah. Why do I write? That's a good question. I write because it's really a way to live a lot of lives. You only got one, but when you're writing stories, you get to live other lives. You get to at least share in other lives. And sometimes if you're writing a first person, like Love Warps the Mind a little, it's like you almost are that other person, because you're telling the story and you're in the head of the character for the whole time. So you can be somebody else, and you get to have your say. You get to say things about the world. You get to actually, you come to understand the world that way. If you're a writer, you have to write everything down. It's a way of thinking that's different than I'm thinking right now as we speak. It's one that's recursive, it slows you down, but it's how you process everything in the world. I keep notebooks and I travel with them, and it's not like a journal that I have to write down what I did that day, because mostly what I did wasn't interesting. I sat and wrote, or took the bus. But it's like, as things occur to me or as I hear things, just write them down. It's like a writer's notebook, and it's all, if I'm trying to figure out what does something mean to me, I just start writing about it. 9/11, right? That morning, just after that, it was so mind-boggling and so incomprehensible. The only way to make the incomprehensible comprehensible for me is to write about it, and to find out what's going on, how I feel about it, what it did to me, why I'm confused, whatever I felt that day. And so, that's a monumental kind of moment, but I do that about everything. Just sit down and write it. So even though I may not get to work on a story today, I'm writing something today. I might be, writers only leave the house to get material. We're not interested in it. We're out there like listening for the right line or getting the right detail or just watching people and paying attention to the world. And that's what writing makes you pay attention, because you're looking for material. You need stuff for your story. And so you're just watching things that other people might sort of just take for granted, or that you might otherwise take for granted.
Well, I hate to say this, but it seems like we're out of time.
Oh,
this has just been such a wonderful conversation, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. This has been Writer to Writer.